our first speaker. Please welcome her, Professor Mairi Knight.
Thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be here today, and I'd just like to say a big thanks to B4 and all the people who've been involved in organising this. It's great to be here and to be speaking today. So just a very brief introduction. I've been working on bees now for longer than I care to remember. I've probably over 20 years working with bees, but actually mostly for the earlier part of my career working on bumblebees. And it wasn't until about 10 years ago when I was contacted by Andrew Brown that I got involved with B4 and started working on honeybees as well. We've been involved with various projects working with B4 over quite a long time period now, and we hope to continue to do so. So my job really here today is just to set the context of what the story is with imports for the preceding talks, to then go into more detail about some of the issues that Selwyn has already outlined. Which, is it this one I use? Yeah, sorry, okay. 30 years and I'm still none the wiser about technology. So one of the key questions, obviously, that we need to first address is why are honeybees being imported? And particularly, we're talking about the UK story here, but of course, much of this applies to any of the kind of countries globally where honeybees are being transported across country boundaries. And there's lots of reasons for that. And these reasons are not mutually exclusive, so it may well be there's a combination of these happening at once. So we've got a lack of locally available queens. So in some areas, people who want to start beekeeping or who are beekeepers have access to queens, but in many areas that's not the case. There's some suggestion that there might be increased demand. So there's been an uptake or an increasing interest in beekeeping, certainly over recent years in the UK. It's quite difficult to get long-term data on the overall trends in beekeeping in the UK. Certainly it went through a dip kind of in the 1970s, and it seems to have been rising quite rapidly since then. But certainly before then, evidence seems to point to actually beekeeping, there being a lot more beekeepers in the UK before that time. So whilst we might have an increased demand over recent times, certainly the number of beehives in the UK used to, in previous times, used to be very high. Another potential reason is due to greater overwintering losses, and beekeepers will obviously be very aware of some of the reasons for that, largely due to diseases, and also partly because imported bees themselves tend to be less good at surviving winter. So queens then need to be replaced in the spring. Early supply of bees, so many of the places we'll come to in a minute, many of the locations that bees are being imported from are Mediterranean countries where bees will start their season earlier, so it means that they are they're in a position to be able to export their bees earlier in the year, and that's something that's attractive to some beekeepers. Cost, it's very cheap. The actual cost of buying a queen online now is between kind of £30 or £50, so it's actually cheap to just push a button online and get some delivery of queens to your door. Convenience, same kinds of reasons. And really importantly, I guess one of the drivers of importation is, of course, a perception that imported bees are better, either because of honey yields, behaviour, docility, all of these kinds of traits, which some of the preceding talkers will go into in more detail. So these are the kinds of reasons why honeybees are being imported into the UK. And as I said, it's a combination of these reasons rather than any one in isolation. So what are the current controls on importing bees into the UK? Just very briefly. There's been new regulations since 2021, so post-Brexit, UK Brexit, preventing the importation of nuclei and packages. So those are larger consignments of bees, either in the case of nuclei, a few combs, or in packages, which are larger kind of mini hives. So it's no longer possible to import bees, honeybees in those to that scale, but of course there's still a very considerable market in importing queens. And the way that this happens is that queens are imported usually with a few attendant workers in these small cages into the UK. And these imports need to be registered. And the imported queens are kept by the importer, and the attendant workers are then sent to FERA in England and Wales, or SAFA in Scotland, where health checks and testing are carried out. I'll come back to that in a minute about those health checks and testing. There is some complication. I'm sure many of you will be aware there has been some complication about imports due to the, again, I'm sure you're aware of the very complicated status of Northern Ireland in relation to the EU and Brexit arrangements. So there's special arrangements in place for Northern Ireland, where for goods for importation, Northern Ireland has been able to remain within the EU single market, and that has effectively provided a kind of backdoor for honeybees to come in through a different route to the rest of England, Wales, and Scotland. And I'll come back to that when we start looking at data. So what is the scale? How big is this operation of importing bees into the UK? This is a graph based on the latest data. So, yeah. So the blue line, the top line, is basically the total amount of imports into the UK that we're aware of. So these are the ones that have been registered. And as you can see, so this is starting at 2007. So actually over quite a short time period, we've seen a really significant rise in the number of imports of honeybees into the UK. So starting from around 7,000 back in 2007 and going up to nearly well over 30,000 from latest estimates from 2024. And we can break that down into, as I mentioned before, we have different ways that honeybees can come into the UK. So we've got queens here, and that makes up the majority of imports. This kind of navy blue line. It looks like our imports of queens into the UK has tailed off, but actually what's happened is this loophole from Northern Ireland has sort of made up for basically this loophole from Northern Ireland is basically a lot of honeybees have come in through that route. So the official import status looks like it's going down, but in fact, because of this Northern Ireland loophole, it's going up. And there's some incidental numbers of packages and nuclei, but the vast majority of imports are coming in from queen imports. So I guess the overall kind of story here is that obviously there's very significant numbers of honeybees coming in, and that's been rising quite dramatically over previous years, over the last few years. So another obvious question then is, why have these imports increased so much over recent years? And again, there's a combination of likely reasons for that, some of which echo the reasons that we've already highlighted a minute ago. So one of the suggestions is, as I said earlier, that there's just increased demand. So there's not enough queens available in the UK, and so people are turning to other countries to be able to import queens from. As I said, there is some evidence. So these figures here are the number of hives registered within the UK, and that's quite an important caveat. So these are the numbers of hives registered. Many of you are probably aware that many hives are not actually officially registered, but these are the data as we know them, the number of hives and the trends over recent years. And it does look like, certainly up until this 2023 data points, certainly looks like the number of hives has been, or the number of hives being kept in the UK is increasing. Again, as I said earlier, it's quite difficult to get historic data about the number of hives that used to be in the UK, but certainly it looks like kind of general increase from about the 1970s, but before then, likely the number of hives in the UK were around these amounts or even higher. So historically, the UK probably had more beehives than it does now, but the trend is upwards. Oh, okay, sorry. Yeah. Okay. Similarly to the other reasons that we're just going through, imports may be increasing because with greater overwintering losses, so queens need to be replaced. And obviously we had Varroa coming into the UK around the beginning of the 1990s. Potentially those greater overwintering losses are driving a demand for more queens. Of course, it might also be related to people just realising that there's a commercial opportunity for importing bees, and there's some indication that a lot of the imports are driven by a few individuals who are then operating as kind of middlemen to then sell on queens within the UK. Convenience. We're all very used to now just shopping online, and people are interested in taking up beekeeping, for example, being able to go online, press a button and have a queen delivered through the post. You can see that that's a convenience that perhaps didn't exist in the past. It's much more accessible and easy to do that. And it's also very cheap to do this. And one of the potential issues, I guess, is that it's so cheap to do this that people don't realise the problems potentially associated with it. So a number of potential reasons why imports may have increased. And another quite important question then is, where are all these bees coming from? This is data from the National Bee Unit that's freely available online. And these data are just from 2024, but you can obviously select and look at the sources of honeybees going back several years, going back many years on this database. So if you look at just 2024, you can see that the majority of bees in 2024 were coming from Italy. After that, we had a significant amount coming from Slovenia, and then a whole range of different countries with slightly fewer amounts coming in. And an important thing to just highlight here is that these data don't include queens that are entering GB, so England, Wales, and Scotland via Northern Ireland, and we don't have reliable data for where those queens are coming from. The reason for particularly highlighting that is if you look at the trends over the last 3 years in terms of where imports are coming from, I've just translated those into, so I looked at the average number of bees coming from different places from 2022 to 2024, and you can see again that the majority or the highest numbers are coming from Italy. There's also a very significant number coming in from Malta, and Malta was absent. If you remember the last table, Malta was absent from that last table, and I suspect that those bees are still coming in from Malta, but they're the ones potentially coming in through that Northern Ireland route. So the reason really particularly for highlighting where these bees are coming from is that this is important, and obviously some of the other speakers will go into much more detail about why that's important. The majority, so this figure here is just highlighting the main sources of those bees. So you can see the darker colours are where more bees are coming from. So Italy is a major source, Malta is also a major source, but Slovenia and also Greece, and then also Denmark up here. So the darker colours are where more bees are coming from effectively. And the reason for highlighting this, the importance of that is that, as many of you I'm sure will be aware, we have different lineages of honeybees that have been well demarcated and identified, and you don't need to worry about any of the rest of the details of this figure. But this figure is indicating where the ancestral ranges of those lineages would be demarcated. So most of Northern Europe is here in blue, is the M lineage honeybees, and Southern Europe here are C lineage bees. And I guess the point to just highlight is that the majority of bees that are being imported to the UK, of course, come from this C lineage part of Europe. And as I said, other speakers will go into much more detail as to why that's an issue. But basically, essentially what it means is we've got lineages that are not native to Northern Europe and certainly to the UK being imported in very high numbers, particularly from Italy and Malta and Greece and down there. And as I said, part of the reason for that is that these bees can be, honey queens can be generated cheaply early in the season in these regions, which is why we provide so many imports to other parts of Europe. And so this is going back to that table again, and I just wanted to highlight, and again, what's happened here? Again, this will be the focus of further talks to come. So Norma's going to be coming up after this talk to talk about disease. But one thing to particularly highlight, of course, I mentioned before that when bees are imported and the attendant workers are sent to FERA or SASA for testing, it was quite striking that if you look at the number of bees that are coming into the UK, the actual numbers of samples that are highlighted that are actually being tested and looked at in detail by FERA are extremely low. And this is an obvious concern that people will come back to in later talks. This is not to either criticise FERA or SASA, it's a resource limitation issue, but this is a real problem in terms of making sure that these imports are not accidentally bringing in a whole range of new or augmenting existing populations of diseases in the UK. Okay, and that's all really I wanted to say, because really my job was to kind of set up what the problem is for the other speakers. The main problems, of course, with these imports coming in are introduction of new pests and pathogens into the UK, and we've already seen some fairly catastrophic examples of that happening in the UK, such as varroa, for example. Genetic homogenization and introgression, the loss of locally adapted genotypes, locally adapted forms of bees, which, again, my colleagues will be talking about in more detail very shortly. And then, really importantly, I think as Selwyn mentioned, obviously it's really important that we find solutions to these problems that are pragmatic and workable for all beekeepers, because otherwise they simply won't be adhered to and people will find loopholes around them. So I think having a positive message in terms of what we can do about this in a way that's going to suit people and try to accommodate people's needs is going to be really important, and I look forward to talking about that. So that's all I'd like to say, and I'd like to just obviously welcome Norman in for his next talk.